So this is my very first quilt, and I didn't name it, I just ended up calling it First Quilt. And it is a very good starting point for kind of my quilting process, because even at the very beginning, I always worked it my way and outside of the box. And even with this first quilt, I was very obstinate. I wanted a first quilt that didn't look like a first quilt. I wanted to be an advanced quilter before I even really knew how to quilt. So I look back on it and I wonder if I was really being smart or I was really just being very stubborn and stupid. But there were certain things that intimidated me about quilting from the very beginning, and one of them was basting a quilt. So actually each of the squares were quilted individually and then pieced together. So the back actually has a checkerboard, black and white checkerboard pattern on it. This created problems with finishing the quilt, and so I ended up just satin stitching the blocks together. But it came together very nicely. I'm very proud of it. Several years actually span between that quilt and this one. This is called the Rainbow Quelt, and I made this for my mother. She had been wanting a quilt, and I kept asking her, well, what colors do you want? She's like, oh, I can't decide. Just use all the colors of the rainbow. So I created this quilt. It's a traditional log cabin, so it pieces up very, very quickly. And actually the pattern of this is available on my website. It's a very quick quilt, but it's very bright and very, very cheerful. And I had quite a lot of fun picking out these bright colors, which I had not really used bright colors like this before in a quilt. Like the evolution of most quilters is to go from piecing to applique. And this is one of the first applique pieces that I made. It's a kind of a combo of applique and piecing. And this is called Balance. It's actually made for a good friend of mine. And it was the first quilt where my goddesses kind of came out. You're going to see a lot of these types of shapes. They're very similar. And designing became a very big thing for me. This is another applique quilted design. It's called Sunflowers. And once I started realizing just the power of sitting down and drawing and how those drawings could become beautiful quilts, it was very addictive, and I still love applique. It's a wonderful design process because applique, you don't have the limitations of sharp angles and squares like piecing. This is another quilt that I designed. It's called The Hills Are Alive. It's another goddess. She kind of keeps reoccurring in the quilts and gets brighter and bigger every time, it seems like. This is a quilt I made after my son was born. It's called Black Tree. It's a very dark time in my life. Trees kind of play an important role in my quilts during that time. Here's another one. This is called Torn Tree. And the interesting thing about this quilt is that the fabric, when I was creating it, I just kind of sat down at my sewing station and I said, okay, I'm just going to play with this. And the fabric's not actually appliqued. I just simply, took strips of brown fabric and wrinkled it all up and just sat and stitched it down as chaotically and as dirty as I could, and then painted the background and quilted it down, and it just came out beautifully. I did play around with the fabric thread painting a little bit. This was actually a piece created for the Art Quilting magazine, Quilting Arts magazine, for their 2009 calendar project. They didn't get in, but they were fun to make, and that's my son's hand, and that one's called Baby Tomatoes. They were a lot of fun, and it's really fun to to do challenge quilts because they really can challenge you. This was a quilt that actually sat on my wall for more than a year before I finally figured out how to quilt it. It's called a food quilt, and it highlights all the different food fabrics that I love to collect. And it took forever to figure out how I wanted to piece it, and then once I had it pieced, it took forever to figure out how I wanted to quilt it. The quilting process really was one of those things that I struggled with at the beginning. And I think there's always that one quilt that really changes everything about the way you quilt and the way you design and the way you work. And that quilt for me was this quilt right here, and this is called Eye of the Forest. And this was the first quilt where I really combined piecing and applique to an extent that I really, really loved. But when it came to the quilting process, it just really didn't work. I actually ended up stippling all of that off-white background, and in the end result, I was just so completely unsatisfied because the piecing and the applique were there. and looked beautiful, but the quilting stitches, the actual texture and quilting stitches of the quilt, simply did not come through, and they were not on the same level as the piecing and applique. And this really kind of started my mission, I guess you could say, to become a better quilter and to really look at the quilting stitches as not just something that holds the 3 layers of the quilt together, but actually as a third dimension of the design. The first dimension being color, the second dimension being shape, and the third dimension being texture, the quilting stitches. And this plays a very, very big role in all of my future quilts. This is the Duchess. Of course, you can't see it very well, so I'm going to actually change the coloring right here on it. Along my journey for trying to become a better quilter, I ran across Karen McTavish and began learning how to do trapunto, and that is a process of making certain areas of your quilt puffier by layering the batting. So some areas of this quilt have an extra layer of batting. And then I started designing this whole cloth, and it was actually designed in honor of Duchess, Lady Georgiana Devonshire, the Duchess of Devonshire. And I looked up, it was so much fun because I just lost myself in traditional Georgian wallpaper designs and came up with this design, and it took a very long time. It was a 6-month quilting process. But 3 of those months were actually spent stitching on 700 beads on the surface of the quilt. I did quilt this quilt for a show with the intention of showing it and competing with it. And my personal advice to anyone who wants to do that, don't stitch 50 million beads on something that you want to show, because they actually ended up starting to fall off. And of course there are always issues with a quilt when it's traveling a lot. And so I've stopped showing it. 6-month quilt, it took 6 months to make it and only showed 3 times. It's kind of disappointing, but I learned so much from creating it. Quilts like the Duchess really make you realize that quilting is a journey and that no quilt is perfect. There are always going to be issues, whether it's an accidental scorch mark from an iron setting too long on a quilt, or it's markings that won't seem to wash out. Something is always going to happen, but it's okay. It's not the end of the world. So this is my most recent quilt, and it's called Light and Me, and this is both applique and heavily quilted. The center figure, the black and the green and white, is appliqued, but everything else, all of the orange and black and red and all of those bright, bright colors are actually painted on the quilt with Shiva paint sticks. And this quilt is very, very densely quilted. You'll see the back here in just a second, and you'll see how much thread was used over the surface of the quilt. And this quilt really started getting me thinking about the free motion filling stitches that I was using. And over the surface of this quilt I really only used stippling and McTavishing, and in some areas, small areas, I used a stitch called flame stitch. And it's got me started thinking just how these fillers really create the texture of our quilt, and that, you know, it adds an extra dimension to our quilts, and that we really needed to have more textures available to us as quilters. Just like painters use a variety of different paints, we needed a variety of different textures to quilt with. And so this launched the 365 Days of Quilting Filler project, which I am currently working on all through 2009 and 2010. And this is a project where every day I sit down at my sewing machine and create a new free motion filler design, and throw up some videos and pictures of it, and it's just so much fun. It's so much fun to have a project to work on every single day, and I love sharing it with quilters all over the world. So I'll close with some photos from this project, and if you're interested in learning more about it, please go to the blog freemotionquilting.blogspot.com.